We're going to talk about reactivity these days. I don't know if any of you have had any of that. No? I read a new term today, election anxiety. Apparently there's a treatment for it. All right. So I'm going to start with a quote from Mark Nepo, a wise contemplative poet. When we heal ourselves, we heal the world. For as the body is only as healthy as its individual cells, the world is only as healthy as its individual souls. And perhaps that rings true for you. It certainly has with people in my life, with myself. I've certainly noticed a softening around the edges that has come with this meditation practice. A little bit more of an ability to flow with life and live with some equanimity. A little less anger, less need to defend myself. Maybe more compassion, even for those with whom I don't agree. And certainly more of a connection with the natural world. And these are gifts of the practice. But then stuff happens, and we struggle again, and the equanimity goes out the window. And I'm here tonight talking about reactivity in this chaotic world because it all came together for me a few weeks ago. It was the madness of, changing people in the election. There have been assassination attempts. We're dealing with endless wars in Sudan, in the Middle East, in Ukraine. I just recall at one point feeling I just wanted to bury my head in the sand and go against my normal pattern, which is to read all the news and stay up on things. But it was too much. I just, couldn't take it anymore. And I shared this with some spiritual friends, a group that I do Sutta study with, and they totally understood. And then they very gently reminded me that there are things we do with these practices that help when we feel we can't take it anymore. We want to put our head in the sand. There are things we do. And they reminded me that the cause of this suffering is not the objects we're focusing on. It's not the election. It's not the war. It's not the national polarization. It's how we're reacting to these events. So when we're feeling fearful, even panicky, or when we're tempted to close ourselves off and just give up, instead of getting caught up in the dramatic and the intense and the juicy, that we can choose where we place our attention to create more of a refuge in practice, a safe and stable place, that these Buddhist practices can help us to develop tranquility and calmness, even in these chaotic times. One example is last week, for anybody who was here, Susan Stone did this elegant meditation where she helped us to land on the one word that brought us back to awareness of the present moment. All practices that we can tap into when we need to, if we just remember, we forget. So tonight I'm going to talk about some practices, many of which you know, but it's the remembering to do them when we need them. So to begin with, what does this Buddhist path tell us about opening to suffering in the world? Now, many of us may have come to our meditation practice for relief from personal anxieties and personal suffering. But if we truly believe, as we're told, that we're all interconnected, then doesn't that mean that we should open ourselves to the whole world, even when it's difficult? Acknowledging not only our own suffering, but perhaps the suffering we cause others, and the collective suffering of those around the planet. There's an ancient Sanskrit poem that I came across, the Buddha Karita, and it tells the story of the Buddha purportedly from his perspective. It says, "But when a man happens to see someone who is old, sick, or dead and remains at ease, unperturbed, he's the same as a senseless man. I, however, am timid, much perturbed, as I think of the dangers of old age, sickness, and death. I find no peace or content, much less joy, seeing the world with fire as if ablaze." And other verses go on to say how the Buddha grieved when he observed the earth dug up by a plow and saw clumps of grass, tiny dead creatures, insects and worms littering the earth. He grieved greatly, as if a kinsman had been killed. So reportedly, it was this recognition of sickness, aging, and death that caused the Buddha to turn away from his own life of luxury and to live a Buddhist philosophy that includes concern for others and a focus on both internal awakening and the external world. The first noble truth: there is suffering in the world, and it can be painful. So if that's our noble truth, how do I approach my relationship with this world in these fraught times and still remain steady and still hold on to my equanimity? Some of the teachings suggest that we ask ourselves, as I walk this path, am I living my values? Am I walking the eightfold path of wise intention, wise speech, and wise action in my daily life? But when we're fired up with fear and injustice, we may need a cooling off of the heart and mind, a sort of coming back to equanimity, so that we can act from these wholesome intentions and be of service to the world. We might need to contemplate, is my mind relating to my experience of the world with more wholesomeness or less? More stress or less? More grasping or less? Mark Nunberg, who's a wonderful teacher out of Minneapolis, describes it this way: appropriate and dynamic action in life depends on being intimate with the conditions of the moment. And tranquility of the body and mind is what allows us to truly connect, to see more clearly and feel more deeply. When we honestly reflect, we see how often we feed cycles of stress and suffering because of the distortions arising from our agitated minds. Of course, it's understandable that we get agitated. Life is difficult for us human beings. But we can acknowledge that agitation and reactivity doesn't help us to be free from these cycles of stress. It's truly heartbreaking to consider how much suffering we have all set in motion in this way, and suffering for ourselves. So as we engage with the world, he posits that we need to begin with clear seeing and an intimacy with the moment, instead of turning away, turning toward. So my strategy of sticking my head in the sand is not going to work. So if we need to see the world, even if it's painful, to open our eyes, to open our hearts, allow our bodies to connect to this experience, when we feel that inner clench, that first feeling that something's wrong, that's our opportunity to get familiar with the painful. Can you notice how it feels in the body? If I have a strong reaction, can I sit with that part of me that's upset? It's a practice Lama Willa Blythe Baker teaches called befriending these feelings. She says that because our typical responses to feeling is often to avoid them or suppress them, or if we can't do that, to try and control them, right? And sadly, these strategies, they just don't work. And they also teach us to avoid these uncomfortable feelings. But that instead, we might try to befriend these beautiful monsters, like befriend my anger, befriend my fear, get to know it, let its story unravel. So this is the first practice. I'm going to invite you to join me. And it's just going to be very brief, for just a few minutes. And I invite you to either sit with your eyes closed or open if that's more comfortable. And just bring to mind a time when you may have felt yourself tense up or react strongly to what's going on in the world. Bring that to mind. And now come inside the body and notice where that feeling might be manifesting. Is there a felt sense in the body? We might move toward that feeling and surround this space with a soft, compassionate, witnessing attention. Attending to the feeling, not the story. Now reassure your feeling. I know in the past I've mistrusted you. I will not try to control you or fix you or suppress you. I will not try to meditate you away. You're welcome here, just as you are. Please remain and practice with me. And just sit and breathe with your feeling. Your fear or your righteous anger. Perhaps feeling the edges soften. And patiently befriending this feeling. This too belongs. Now we might just acknowledge with gratitude our awareness of this feeling and return here to the room. I wonder if anyone has had an experience they would care to share. Of this invitation to befriend our feelings. Well, there'll be other opportunities. So inviting these feelings in, we see them more clearly. And then it can be helpful to explore what's beneath them. What's beneath these reactions to the suffering or the chaos. It helps us understand where our distress comes from. The teacher, Don Mauricio, says, the more we become familiar with our own inner landscape, the more we step out of reactivity and into responsiveness. So becoming familiar with what's underneath there. And just a couple of common sources of reactivity. Fear. Fear's a big one. Is there fear or a sense of being overwhelmed by that fear? There are so many valid reasons to be fearful about dysfunction or divisiveness and the impact elections could have on our families or our communities or those who are very vulnerable. And when we're scared to death, think about how we react. With an activated fight or flight response, self-defense, or maybe it's the avoidance, the head in the sand response, or anger. And while we're reacting to valid concerns, we may not be operating out of our best selves. Because when we don't fully understand that we're driven by fear or grief, our reactions can be to lash out in anger or violence, less wholesome ways of addressing the problem. And we can act in the world with a mindset that comes from scarcity and us and them feeling, this separateness, all forms of greed, hatred, and delusion. And not only are these more painful ways to react, they're just less effective. And another source of reactivity can be that sense of, I know what's right and it's not going my way. In this contentious political climate, we tend to cast the others as the idiots who don't understand. And how many hearts and minds do we persuade with that attitude? We've seen how effective that is. So can we accept that we just might not know what is best? Or if it's really clear what the wholesome path is, can we just accept that it may be out of our control? We can have preferences without clinging to this certainty that it's going to be a catastrophe if it doesn't go my way. And again, Mark Nunberg, he says, it's okay to want a sports team to win as long as wisdom understands it's out of your control. And sometimes that's the step back we need. There's a poem from the first free woman, the early Buddhist nuns, that talks about the support for the path when things don't go our way. And it's called Lucky. You always considered yourself lucky because things seem to work out the way you wanted. Now luck has a different meaning. Lucky to be walking a path that finds peace in the arising and passing away of each present moment, regardless of how things work out or don't. Another gift of the practice, this confidence that things will be okay, whether or not things go our way. So in this world where we're not in control, what can we do to cultivate the tranquility, the calmness, the stability of mind and body that allows us to be grounded and act out of our best selves? I mean, we can call upon our values, our intentions, our beliefs. With mindfulness and calmness, we can prepare ourselves to act with wisdom and compassion. You know, we might ask, is my anger or my advocacy or my critique helpful? Am I voicing it in a way that it might be heard? When I interact with those who don't agree with me, including my family members, do I engage with respect and compassion and mindful listening and speaking? And am I able to stay in touch with my feelings as I interact? With this compassion and wisdom, we're a lot less likely to separate from others out of stress and fear. But when adversity arises, and it will, we can take that adversity and make it part of our path and rely on some trusted meditation practices for support and refuge. I think most of us are familiar with the loving kindness or metta practices, so I won't spend a lot of time talking about that. But for many people, that's really a go-to practice when we're feeling concerned, because it reminds us to bring back some self-care and goodness and love, and to share that as far as we can with those around us in our circles of concern. I like to think of it as we can become more of a peaceful, loving being. So when you make a drop in the pond, you create ripples instead of being a cannonball making waves. So the metta practice is a lovely option, but I'd like to talk about just a couple of other, maybe less familiar practices that can be helpful as well. There's a whole idea of creating refuge to cultivate tranquility and calmness, creating our practice as a refuge and intentionally doing that. Just cultivating as a place of safety, sort of a spiritual home, a place to go. Again, Lama Willa recently shared some new research, scientific research on scientists who are trying to find places in the world that they call refugia. And these are places of safety and refuge in the natural world where animals and ecosystems can survive and thrive during the climate crisis, during climate change. So it might be a protected forest or maybe a valley where the air pollution doesn't get there, it doesn't hurt them. And this helps researchers understand what helps ecosystems survive and thrive. So in the same way, we can create a supportive refuge that helps us feel safe and thrive, and to be intentional, turn our attention in that way. And with the support of our teachers, our community, our Sangha. So this second reflection, again, very brief. I invite you again to take a moment with your eyes open or closed and to create this sense of refuge as we go to practice. Lama Willa suggests that we ask, in whose presence do you feel safe, loved, and seen? Just bringing these beings to mind. In whose presence do you feel safe, loved, and seen? Be a loved one, a guide, a teacher, an animal. And in what places do you feel safe, loved? We can ask, what do I need to feel safe and easeful so that I can relax into the depth of practice? Now imagine that you invite and invoke these people and places to start your meditation practice, to start from this place of safety refuge. And thank you. And another final approach that I'd like to share is that sense of once we notice we're activated, there are so many wonderful somatic or body-centered practices that can help us recapture that sense of safety. Many of us are familiar with self-compassion practices where we might use touch in the heart and the belly. There's movement practices like yoga that help us. And I'd like to share a practice that I learned from Kyra Jewel Lingo. I've shared previously. I'd like, again, to remember that we can go here when we feel activated. We can go to a practice like this. It's called caring for the vagal nerve, the nerve that sends signals from the brain to the nervous system in the body. I'm going to practice just doing this. For those of you who wear glasses, you might want to take them off for this, as they'll be more comfortable. So again, eyes open or closed. Just invite you to begin this caring for the vagal nerve practice. We begin by touching and massaging the fleshy outer parts of our ear, from the top to the earlobe, just rolling those outer edges. Because first, we listen to know that we're safe, that there are no lions coming out of the bush to eat us. And this soothes the vagal nerves and tells us to go into rest and digest. Next, taking the fleshy part of our palms and rubbing them together and placing them over our eyes with light pressure. Because after we listen for safety, we look for safety. Just rest the eyes. Then bring our palms to our cheeks. And just holding the cheeks, envision a loving person holding our cheeks, like holding a dear child. Then receive this care. Next, take the hands to the heart center, one over the other, and feel the support and kindness of the hands. And whisper, I'm safe in this moment. I'm bringing support to myself. Breathe in and out. And moving our palms down our torso to the area below our belly button. Offering care and support for the abdomen. And breathing into the belly. Feeling the contact of the hands on the belly. And resting. And finally, turning the palms upward and rest them on our thighs in an open gesture of receiving and letting go. And just let it sink in and notice how it feels in our body. refuge in the body. Returning to the wise Mark Nepo, who says, in a world that lives like a fist, mercy is not more than walking with your hands open. We grip our hands when we're angry or afraid or holding on by a thread. It's a gesture of tension, animosity, fight. And instead, we might choose to open our hands, open our hearts. Might we choose to clearly see the world and become intimate with our feelings and befriend our reactivity? Might we choose tranquility over intensity and cultivate a safe and peaceful refuge where our wakeful presence creates a place of peace and a trustworthy home? Thank you for your attention.